Close your eyes for a moment, and picture this. A crowd gathers in the heart of a medieval town square. Mothers clutch their children. Men stand silent, pale with dread. And before them, a trembling prisoner is dragged into the open, his fate already sealed. There will be no mercy today. No last-minute pardon. What comes next is not simply death, but suffering so cruel, so deliberate, that it was designed to break not just the body, but the very soul. To make the condemned beg for death long before it finally arrived. Some were lowered alive into boiling cauldrons, their screams echoing until their lungs burned out. Others were tied to the breaking wheel, every bone shattered under the weight of iron. And still more, were subjected to devices so monstrous, they turned human agony into public theater. But here is the question you must face: how could human beings do this to one another? How could ordinary men and women stand in silence, and watch? Would you have joined the crowd? Or would you have been the one condemned, praying for the end? If you're brave enough to confront these horrors of the past, hit that subscribe button right now. But if you'd rather look away, at least tell us in the comments why you choose the comfort of ignorance over the weight of truth. Among the most horrifying punishments of the Middle Ages was a death that blurred the line between execution and pure torture: boiling alive. This was not the swift strike of a sword, nor the sudden fall of an axe. This was a slow descent into fire made liquid, a death that stripped away every ounce of dignity, every layer of flesh, until nothing remained but steam, screams, and silence. The condemned was bound in iron chains, dragged by guards through the jeering crowd, and brought before a cauldron so large it seemed forged by hell itself. The liquid inside could vary: water, oil, tar, pitch, even molten lead. Whatever the substance, the outcome was the same: unimaginable agony. Witnesses described the moment the body touched the liquid. Skin blistered and split instantly. Steam seared the throat and lungs, choking cries into broken gasps. Sometimes, the executioners would lower the victim slowly, limb by limb, prolonging the torture until every nerve had tasted the cauldron's fury. Other times, the condemned was dropped whole, their last moments consumed by boiling madness. This was not myth. In 1531, under the order of King Henry VIII, the punishment of boiling was written into English law. It was used specifically for poisoners, whose crime was seen as cowardly, invisible, and deserving of the most public and painful death. At Smithfield, a man named Richard Roos was condemned for lacing a pot of porridge with poison. His sentence: to be boiled alive. Accounts tell us he shrieked and writhed in the pot for nearly 2 hours before his body finally gave way. Elsewhere, in the Holy Roman Empire, counterfeiters, those who defiled the currency of kings, were subjected to the same fate. Oil or pitch was often chosen, thick liquids that clung to the skin and burned deeper than water ever could. The condemned was not just killed. They were turned into an example, a warning, a human lesson etched in pain. And the crowds came. They came not only out of fear, but curiosity. What does a body look like when it boils? How long can a human being last in such torment? These were not questions whispered in private, they were answered openly, in the public square, with children watching, merchants pausing their trade, and priests praying aloud that sin itself was being purged. Think about it. What would go through your mind, standing there in the square? Would you cover your ears as the condemned screamed? Would you pray for their soul, or would you watch, unable to turn away, as the flesh melted from bone? If boiling destroyed the flesh with fire, what of the punishments that shattered the bones, one by one, leaving the condemned alive for hours, sometimes days? Could you endure the breaking of every limb while your neighbors watched? In 1581, a German outlaw named Peter Neers, accused of sorcery and murder, was executed on the wheel. Chroniclers wrote that his limbs were smashed with an iron bar, his broken body placed on the wheel and left exposed. He suffered for hours before death finally claimed him. Some accounts tell of others who clung to life even longer, days of torment, their shattered bodies slowly shutting down as crows and insects feasted upon them. The cruelty did not always end with death. The wheel itself was often erected upright, the corpse displayed to rot in the open air. Sometimes fire was lit beneath it, burning away what the iron had left. Other times, the executioner would deliver a final coup de grace, a mercy blow to the chest or head, if, and only if, the crowd demanded an end. Imagine lying there, every bone in your body broken, your lungs gasping for air, your mouth dry from hours in the sun. You hear the crowd, cheering, jeering, whispering prayers. But none come close to help you. You are alive, but no longer human, reduced to a warning nailed to a wheel. And the people stayed. They stayed to watch the body twist. To see how long it would last. They stayed because the wheel was not only punishment, it was performance. And your agony was the show. But if the wheel broke bodies for the crowd, what of the punishment that burned souls for God? Of all the punishments of the Middle Ages, none carried more symbolic weight than burning at the stake. Fire was not chosen only for its cruelty, but for its meaning. To the church, flames purified the soul. To the state, flames erased the body. And to the crowd, flames delivered a spectacle they would never forget. The condemned were led to a wooden post, bound with chains or ropes. Beneath their feet, bundles of dry faggots, kindling soaked in pitch, or even barrels of oil. The pyre was carefully constructed, not to kill swiftly, but to burn slowly, feeding upon flesh and bone while the air filled with the smell of smoke, tar, and seared skin. In the 15th century, countless heretics met their fate in flames. In 1431, Joan of Arc, accused of witchcraft and heresy, was bound to the stake in Rouen, France. Eyewitnesses said she called upon God until the fire took her voice. Her ashes were thrown into the river Seine, so that no relics of her body would remain. To the English, it was justice. To the Church, purification. But to history, it was martyrdom. But not all victims were saints. Thousands accused of sorcery, witchcraft, or heresy faced the stake. In Germany, entire witch trials ended with flames devouring dozens at once. The accused, mostly women, were bound, sometimes gagged, sometimes forced to watch others burn before their own pyre was lit. The smoke rose as high as the prayers, mingling into the sky like a plea unanswered. And the fire itself was unpredictable. If the wind blew, flames could whip suddenly, scorching skin before death arrived. If the pyre was poorly built, smoke suffocated before fire consumed. In some cases, merciful executioners tied pouches of gunpowder around the victim's neck, so an explosion would spare them prolonged torment. But mercy was rare. More often, the condemned writhed, twisting against their bonds, until their body gave in to the fire. And through it all, the crowd remained. They came not only to see justice, but to feel it. Parents brought their children. Vendors sold food and drink. The cries of the dying mingled with the chatter of the living. It was a festival of fire, an unholy communion. And yet, many looked upon the flames and believed it was holy. They believed the fire cleansed. That God demanded this sacrifice. That human flesh was fuel for divine order. And so the fires burned for centuries, devouring thousands in the name of salvation. But if fire consumed the body in public, what of the punishments that tore the body apart in secret? Devices designed not just to kill, but to unravel the human form. In the next chapter, we descend into the torture chamber, where the rack stretched victims beyond their breaking point. The rack was deceptively simple, a wooden frame, sometimes the length of a man, sometimes larger, fitted with rollers and ropes at either end. The victim was bound at the wrists and ankles. With each turn of the wheel, the ropes tightened. Muscles strained. Joints popped. Ligaments tore apart. Bones cracked. And with every movement, the victim's body was stretched further, closer to dislocation, closer to ruin. In England, the rack was infamously known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after the official who introduced it in the 15th century. It was feared not only for its cruelty, but for its purpose, extracting confessions. Heretics, traitors, conspirators, all were placed upon its wooden frame, until truth, or lies disguised as truth, were torn from their lips. Few ever left the rack unbroken. Imagine it, your arms pulled one way, your legs another. The sound of sinews ripping, like ropes snapping under strain. The chest stretched so wide that breathing became a desperate task. Executioners often worked in silence, listening for each scream, each groan, each plea, until the prisoner uttered what they wished to hear. Confession, denial, it didn't matter. The rack did not care for truth. It cared only for submission. One of the most famous victims was Guy Fawkes, accused in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. After days of interrogation, Fawkes was placed on the rack in the Tower of London. His once bold signature, strong and defiant, was reduced to a trembling scrawl, barely legible. His body was shattered, but his spirit had been forced into silence. The rack had done its work. And yet, the rack was not always about confessions. Sometimes, it was simply punishment. Victims left upon it for hours could suffer permanent dislocation, paralysis, or death by shock. Some were released, broken shells of their former selves, unable to walk, their arms dangling lifeless. Others were discarded, their bodies too ruined to survive. What makes the rack so terrifying is not just the pain it caused, but the silence it represented. Unlike the burning stake or the breaking wheel, the rack had no audience. Its victims were not displayed to the masses, but hidden away in dark chambers, reduced to whispers in history. Their confessions filled the records, but their screams, those were lost in the shadows of stone walls. And ask yourself, if truth can be torn from the body, stretched into falsehood by the rack, then how many of the confessions that shaped history were real? How many were simply the echoes of torture, preserved as fact? Rat torture was not a device, it was a living horror. The victim was bound flat, often in a dungeon where vermin already thrived. A cage or bucket filled with starving rats was fastened against the prisoner's bare abdomen or chest. Then, the executioner heated the cage with fire, forcing the panicked rats to burrow deeper, clawing, gnawing, until flesh gave way to muscle, and muscle gave way to organs. Imagine the terror, the scratching from the inside, the realization that death would not come quickly, but through the frantic hunger of living creatures. This was not execution by steel, but by nature itself, turned into a weapon. To those who witnessed, the screams were unlike any others, high and frenzied, until they dissolved into silence. In those dark cells, rats did not simply feed, they devoured. But if rats gnawed from within, the boot crushed from without. Known across Europe, the boot was a device placed around the victim's leg, sometimes made of wood, sometimes of iron. Wedges were hammered into the frame, each blow driving wood or metal deeper into the flesh. Bones splintered. Tendons snapped. Blood poured freely as the leg was reduced to pulp. The condemned was left screaming, not for life, but for the mercy of unconsciousness. In Scotland, the boot became infamous during witch trials, where countless women were accused of consorting with the devil. They were forced into boots, their legs crushed until they confessed to crimes they never committed. Some lost their feet entirely, others, their sanity. It was not about guilt or innocence. It was about control, pain as proof, screams as evidence. The cruelty of these methods lies in their intimacy. Fire could burn a body, and wheels could break it apart. But the boot and the rat attacked the very core of a person, their flesh, their marrow, their organs. Death was not immediate, and survival was often worse. Victims carried shattered bones, mangled limbs, and unimaginable trauma for the rest of their lives, if they lived at all. And still, crowds justified it. Authorities declared it necessary. They believed terror kept order, and pain revealed truth. But all it truly revealed, was how creative mankind can be in its cruelty. Some punishments in the Middle Ages were not satisfied with death. They sought something deeper, humiliation. They turned suffering into mockery, turning the condemned into living symbols of sin, corruption, and warning. Among these, the Iron Maiden, the Mask of Shame, and the hanging cage remain the most haunting. The Iron Maiden was perhaps the most infamous of all, though some argue it was more legend than practice. Imagine a sarcophagus of iron, standing tall like a coffin. Its doors were lined with cruel spikes, positioned not to pierce the heart, but to stab the flesh, the shoulders, the legs. The victim was locked inside, trapped in utter darkness, bleeding slowly as metal pressed deeper with each trembling breath. Some lingered for hours. Others, for days. Death was not quick, it was deliberate. Yet humiliation did not always require blood. The mask of shame was worn in towns and villages across Europe. Forged of iron or copper, it covered the face, grotesquely shaped into animal muzzles, long tongues, or twisted grins. Some were fitted with spikes inside the mouth, pressing against the tongue to prevent speech. The condemned, often accused of gossip, blasphemy, or lewd behavior, were paraded through the streets, their shame made visible. Laughter replaced mercy, and the punishment lay not in death, but in ridicule. But the cruelest of all may have been the hanging cage. Suspended from towers, gates, or even church walls, these iron cages held prisoners for days, weeks, sometimes until their very bones fell into dust. Crows pecked at their flesh. The sun burned them by day, the cold froze them by night. Some starved, others rotted alive. The cage turned their bodies into warnings, decaying reminders that justice never sleeps. Even in death, there was no peace. Their corpses hung long after life had fled, swaying in the wind like puppets of damnation. What makes these punishments so terrifying is not just their brutality, but their cruelty of meaning. The Iron Maiden made death into ritual. The mask of shame turned dignity into laughter. The hanging cage denied even the silence of the grave. Each was designed not only to hurt, but to erase humanity itself, to strip away the last fragments of identity until nothing remained but an example. Starvation was one of the oldest forms of slow punishment. Prisoners were cast into dungeons, left with nothing but darkness, stone, and their own hunger. At first, the body burned with gnawing emptiness. Then, weakness set in. Muscles wasted. Voices cracked. And finally, death arrived not as a sudden strike, but as a whisper, days or weeks after the last morsel of food had been consumed. But starvation was only the beginning. Among the most horrifying executions in ancient and medieval lore was scaphism, a method said to have been used by the Persians, though tales of it spread into Europe as the ultimate nightmare. The condemned was trapped between two boats or within a hollowed log, their head, arms, and legs protruding. Milk and honey were forced down their throat until they vomited, their skin smeared with the same mixture. At first, it seemed almost merciful. But then came the insects. Attracted by the honey, swarms of flies, wasps, and maggots descended upon the victim. They crawled across the skin, into the mouth, the ears, the eyes. They laid eggs in wounds and orifices. The boats were left floating in stagnant water, where mosquitoes thrived. The victim did not die quickly. They lingered, eaten alive, inside and out, for days, sometimes even weeks. Death was not release. It was infestation. But perhaps nothing struck more terror into the hearts of medieval men than impalement. Crude, simple, and brutally effective, it turned the human body into a living banner of suffering. A sharpened stake was forced into the victim, sometimes through the abdomen, sometimes through the rectum or vagina, and driven upward through the body until it emerged from the chest, the back, or even the mouth. The stake was then planted upright, leaving the victim suspended in the air. Some died quickly, from shock or blood loss. Others lived for hours, even days. Their bodies convulsed as they slid further down the stake under their own weight, organs tearing, breath choking, screams dissolving into hoarse silence. And all the while, the crowd gathered below, gazing up at a human body turned into a grotesque monument of terror. In Eastern Europe, impalement became infamous under Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler. Chronicles describe entire forests of stakes, thousands of bodies writhing and rotting in the sun, lining the roads as a warning to his enemies. Travelers wrote of the stench that carried for miles, the air thick with decay. Whether legend or truth, one fact is certain: impalement was not just execution. It was terror carved into the land itself. What makes these lingering deaths so horrifying is not only the pain, but the time. To burn was agony, but it was brief. To be broken was torment, but it ended. To starve, to be eaten alive, to be impaled, these were punishments that stretched a moment of death into an eternity. Victims did not simply die, they endured death again and again, with every passing hour. We have seen men broken on wheels, women burned at the stake, children left fatherless as their parents were shamed, tortured, or impaled. These were not just deaths, they were performances of suffering, staged for power, for fear, and for the darkest entertainment of the crowd. Something we would rather forget, that human beings are capable of turning punishment into spectacle, cruelty into ritual, and pain into tradition. And while centuries have passed, the truth is more unsettling: the hunger for violence has never truly left us. It lingers in the stories we tell, in the headlines we consume, in the dark corners of our curiosity. Every execution we have explored tonight carries one question: how could they do this? But the real question is this: how different are we today? We may no longer gather in the town square to cheer the burning of flesh, but cruelty still survives in quieter forms. And if history has shown us anything, it is that forgetting these horrors only allows them to return. You have heard their screams. You have seen their agony. The question now is, will you walk away in silence, or will you carry their memory forward? Because if you do nothing, their pain dies with you. And silence, too, is a kind of death. If you are brave enough to keep uncovering the darkest truths of history, subscribe right now. But if you choose to turn away, then tell us why. Tell us why you'd rather forget the cries of the broken, the burned, the impaled. Because the truth will not wait. The silence will not protect you. And the next story may be yours.